Dan, great to see you. And thanks for your connections. I made a nice contact with your referral. And, I like to introduce Dan because I know at the beginning of the talk, I can follow him. And then it goes so deep and it's so, such an evolution of consciousness, the levels that Dan is talking at, that he wants people to come up to that level. If we're really going to make peace on the planet, if we're going to make peace, we're going to understand the science of the incarnational form, the right way to meet spirit. It is a science. And I think in however many years, people are going to be studying the science of Dan's understanding, the science of spirituality, the science of consciousness, that right now, what we know is just grasping at straws and trying to make sense of something Dan has been formulating for the last 30, 40 years. He's put it together in a way we need to rise to the level of understanding where we can embrace this teaching. So Dan, thanks for being here, and take it slow. Even though I've heard your talk, I'm still trying to integrate all these concepts, longitudinal waves and implosion and all that. So it always helps me, even if I've heard, to find some of the concepts as you plunge into the awakening of forever awareness. So does it make sense?
Well, thank you so much, Ellen. You're too kind. You're way too kind.
Yeah. Thanks for being here.
Yes. Well, I was very pleased when I saw that the theme of this series for Portal to Ascension was the sort of ancient origins, ET, ancient history. Right. And so I've kind of chosen today as a theme for this talk, the decoding the extraterrestrial origins of Earth religions as a way to understand a deeper science of the physics of ascension and spiritual growth. Actually, that's sort of the subject today, for what it's worth.
That's right. That's right in line with a lot of work Neil does all the time, putting together these greater cosmologies. So
yes. Thanks. And most people here know that I've been studying the extraterrestrial origins of Earth's humans for most of my life. And we have dozens of films about that. It's all at fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And fusion in the blood is the metaphor because, when you have that bliss implosion in the blood, then you, in fact, you ride the long wave, and that implosion radiates the longer field effect, which we call ascension. And we talked about the physics of that many times. So what we wanted to talk about today particularly was, we have new information now about Earth's extraterrestrial history. Because,
are you going to show a PowerPoint? Are you showing?
Yes, yes, I have a few images here, yes.
Okay.
And
yeah, just see if you can get on the PowerPoint. Just see if you're a co-host and.
Okay, let's see.
You should be. Okay, perfect. But yeah. Okay, great.
So we're going to be talking about this. Let's see, this ET series here, the ancient Uru, the Uru-an here. So this is what Diana calls the Siakar, and what Megan Rose call their word for the Draco is the ancient Ur, as in Uru, the ancient Draco blood. And you see how this term Uru is common to all our historical words for bloodlines, the Anagur, the Magyar, the Uran, Urup, the
even Uluru,
exactly. Durga, Asa Uru being Assyria or Assyria, and Uru Asa Elamdru. So, somebody should ask who Uru is, and now we pretty well know who Uru is, and Uru is in fact means ancient Draco blood. That's what it means. And the point I want to make is that the community of sources has converged very well now to agree on that ET history. Namely, you know, I was inspired by Alex Collier so many years ago when I was living in Boulder. And Alex introduced me to Morna and Phaseus, with whom I later had some direct telepathic communication. And now Alex Collier just completed his interview with Elena Danaan today and Megan Rose with Donnie Henderson. And Michael Sala has even joined from Exopolitics, Elena Danaan and Michael Rose. And so the descriptions of the ET history, the dragon history, and the fact that the Federation has now pretty much succeeded in removing many of the Draco from the solar system, there is so much agreement, whether it's the SSP survivors or whether it's the communicators with the Federation, Elena Danaan and Megan Rose, or whether it's Alex Collier, who's now interviewing with both of them, or whether it's Michael Sala. Everyone agrees. There is, you know, there's almost universal agreement there. Of course, it's kind of funny. The one sort of ET source that's out of sync a bit is this Gosha Swaru from the Tegatan Pleiadians, who is still preaching that the Federation is the bad guys. Well, but it's sort of funny because that's the same Tegatan Pleiadians whose female dominance resulted in 80% females, and they were using parthenogenesis. And as a result, the Andromedans predicted their bloodline was basically losing ensoulment. And in fact, Swaru as much as admitted too much time travel, fractionation, loss of ensoulment. But it's fascinating because when we realized that Enki of the Anunnaki, when they left Pleiades, as Anton Parks outlined very well, and maybe we'll show that slide. So we're going to be talking about Anton Parks some here. Let's see here, plus supplement. Uru temp, we got to get the right slideshow. So we're going to be talking here about Anton Parks. And here's the slide. So he is saying that Enki here later was called Osiris, and his face is green in every statue in Egypt, and now we know exactly why. But Anton Parks is not very good at giving us the big picture, because Elena Danaan has been much more clear that the Anunnaki, of whom he is the family, in fact, were parasitic and came through a portal in Orion. And so when we are working out, for example, the extraterrestrial roots of the Christian religion, and that's one of the big things I want to talk about here. Here, let's see, here's more pictures. So that's a Draco Orion queen from the literature, and there's much more pictures later. Here's Anton Parks' 2 books in English. And here's the slide we want to talk about when we want to talk about the origin of the Mormon religion, that when Joseph Smith was studying to interpret the Urim and Thummim from the copper plates, the Mormon tablets, he was studying this language here, the Akkadian, ancient Akkadian, Akkadian, Society of the Chaldean, which we later learn is part of the Draco Uru language of the females. You see that this is a point. As we're studying the roots of Earth religions, what we're learning here is that Draco, as they were, their roots are described in the book Thiuba in the French tradition, which they say is the root of the term Yehovah, Yahweh. And at that time, the Draco were androgynous. And when they started reproducing sexually, there was a war of the sexes, actually, in Draco ancient history. And that meant that in the Draco, as Anton Parks reports in more detail than Elena Danaan, there was a separate language for the men and the women. And this is, the male language was called Imagir, which was the language of the princes, which became Sumerian on Earth. And we know the Sumer means more than South Sea. It means Somer, means dragon or Draco. And whereas the female language of the Draco was called Emesa, from our word emanate, and that then became the Babylonian and the Chaldean, Akkadian, the language that Joseph Smith studied in order to interpret the Mormon tablets. Now, there was an agenda there, which this is what's so fascinating about Earth religions, that if you go to the root of the religion and you're aware of the ET history, you see that when Joseph Smith learned of the seraphim, which is the winged dragon history, he was influenced by this angel named Gabriel. And yet, in the Christian tradition, who introduces the bloodline? It is Gabriel. And when Muhammad in the Muslim tradition is introduced to the quote unquote extraterrestrials, it is Gabriel who does it. So someone should be asking, well, what was the agenda of Gabriel? And it obviously had to do with genetics. And that fits what we're learning about the bigger picture here. The genetics of Gabriel is old Draco, what we would call high Siakar. A Siakar is a word Lena Denon introduced to describe the high princes of the Draco, which I learned years ago from Michael Helios. Actually, that's a word that was not new to us. Point being that if we study the history of Draco, we learn that they came from, well, we now know it's their home star, where their queen, and it is a female line. Remember that the Draco line is led by a dragon queen, quite literally. We now know it's a white queen. And actually, Johann Fritz, who's been on our shows several times, has met the white queen of the Draco. Quite scary, actually. And we learned later that when we said that Enki, when he came from the cloning pot in Pleiades to Earth, and started basically every religion on Earth under the name Ab-Ra, as in Abraham. He's the Ra in Abraham, later Osiris. Each religion started with a fear of women. And one could ask, well, was that fear of women of the Pleiadian female dominated? And no, actually, now we learn it's a bigger picture. The fear of women that started every religion on this planet was the Draco queen. And we need to learn about the genetic agenda, because that has to do with where humans were steered. Remember, at that time, we were mostly slaves and snack food. And that's what we're looking through to see a bigger picture here. Namely, that in their home star, there was a higher percentage of radioactivity. We believe the Draco blood, as I've said before, was a lipid oil-dominated blood, and they breathe in mostly nitrogen and out cyanogen, dragon breath, bones more carbon, and nerves more silicon. So the silicon nerve, they had higher wave propagation phase velocity, and therefore higher frequency brain wave for the Draco, which meant more telepathy, but less long wave, therefore less empathy. And we see that in their brainwave power spectra, we believe. Point being that on their home star, with their blood chemistry, a nitrogen dominated, a low level of radioactivity was actually, as in the Paul Brown nuclear battery, an electron cascade stimulant. That actually a low level of radioactivity was a stimulant to the Draco. And so on every planet here where the Draco are winning, you see radioactivity going up. And we have that famous slide here of the Iradia couple in Russia. Oops, gotta get the right slide here, window. That they were born too close to Chernobyl. And in fact, they had metabolized so that radioactivity was actually catalyzing metabolism. So this is an example of understanding the ET origins of Earth religions. For example, those same Anunnaki had to nuke their way through the Van Allen belts, and the container for the nukes was a Syrian-built implosive capacitor called the Ark of the Covenant. And so they had a relationship with radioactivity, which in the Bible was called the nitrogen poisoning, or the plague of Azoth, which also meant radiation poisoning, which in fact, the evidence of nuclear blasts in the Sinai are overwhelming. So back to the genetic agenda. So in the Draco blood chemistry, that low-level radioactivity, which was a stimulant to them, produced too many genetic deviations. So for mutations. So for the Draco, DNA that changes is defective. Let's just call it the Monsanto mistake. And so genetic diversity is the opposite of what Draco aimed for, which is one of the reasons they're interested in getting a library card to Earth DNA, because they forgot about genetic diversity. And so they used a tracking method, which basically was index of the spiral on the torus, later called Hebrew and Sanskrit, which is a genetic sequencing tetrahedrally indexed plasma sequence alphabet of DNA codon symmetry sequences. In other words, it's DNA records. And that's what those copper foils were, because DNA records are the heart of Draco attempts to prevent DNA from changing and the origin of Mormonism. And that's why when Joseph Smith had to look through Urim and Thummim, it was actually a quartz tetrahedron, to index the plasma domain symmetry to render the longitudinal field visible, called clairvoyance or scrying. And typically a phase conjugate media is used for the scrying, which was the black mirror of obsidian ancestor phone calls from the Olmec, or Nostradamus's black mirror, or John Dee's black mirror. It was a case of a phase conjugate dielectric used to index longitudinal interferometry, super high dielectric, which is how you make ancestor phone calls and call angels. And we're going to talk about the astral hygiene problems associated, namely the black goo, when we get to the Muslim story. So we don't want to bring in too many themes at once, but we're trying to make the point is that if we see the extraterrestrial origins of the myths of religion on Earth, we can get a deeper picture of the physics of ascension and enlightenment. And to move toward that story, I want to go into the Thoth, Enki, Anunnaki connection. So remember, Elena Danaan has now given us more information that the Anunnaki actually, although they did come through Orion, they were actually in conflict also with the Draco, which makes sense because our word Assyria, which the Hebrews pronounce Asuria, as in Asa Uru. And you know, if you don't know what Asa Uru is in Asa Uru LM Jerusalem, you need to know who Asa Uru is. Asa is queen of, Uru is ancient dragon blood, Draco. And so we have been describing with Anton Parks and my book on Enki's life, goldenmean.info/Enki, for decades, you know, the heroic potential that exists in the genetic line, which we now know was Enki, Thoth. Thoth was the science officer of, later called Hermes, later called Quetzalcoatl, later called Viracocha. It's the same guy. Thule, which was the name for Atlantis, also means Tahuti, which also means Thoth, which later was abbreviated DWD, which we now know is literally the line of David, means Thoth. And the whole line of Egyptian royalty is named Thothmosis, Moesis, which transliterated means sons of Thoth. So it seems like if we want to know the origins of Christianity, we need to know who Thoth was, since every good historian who studied the origins of Christianity calls it, quote, out of Egypt. That's the name of the book by Ahmed Osman, later adopted by Lawrence Gardner. Everybody agrees it came out of Egypt. So what was the agenda? You know, like Thoth, aside from the fact that Atlantis was named after him, and the Palladians called that just a reptilian parasitism. They didn't have much respect for it at all. So this becomes an even more important question after we just finished in our second film in the 4-film professional film made series on the science of the Grail mysteries at goldenmean.info/Grail, announcing in great detail that the Black Madonna, who gave birth to John Trophime, who melted the stone lid of his coffin called Holy Grail Platinum, was sons of Thoth, the blue-black blood, Chem meaning blue-black, of Egypt, the original term Egypt, of the Black Madonna, Sarah the Egyptian. Why was she black? She was the daughter of Thoth. So if you go back again to the Jesus Magda story, you come to Thoth. And if you go to Out of Egypt and House of the Messiah and all the academic books on the Egyptian origins of Christianity, it's that Akhenaten either was Moses or his royal consort was Moses. Either way, then Akhenaten, Tutankhamun becomes Moses, Jesus, literally the righteous priest. So again and again, we have this bloodline of Thoth, Enki, Osiris being literally the bloodline of Christianity. So if someone is now telling us, I have to plug my thing in here just one second. If someone is now telling us that, you know, these Anunnaki from which Thoth arrived with Enki, if they're now telling us that these were interventionists and they're a little bit parasitic, this might collapse the romance of the Christian story a little bit. Like, oh dear, maybe these are not the heroes of history. And when I wrote a book on Enki shortly after my Kundalini intense experiences, as did then Sitchin. It seems that everybody who has intense Kundalini wakes up one day and either says, oh, well, I was Jesus or I was Enki. It gets a little boring after a while. But there is archetype there. And we say, well, yes, Enki was a hero in the sense that he had a vision for the genetic evolution of Earth. And it's true. His other name, Nudimmud, meant the cloner. And Elena Danaan gets it right that the Anunnakis were specialists in genetic engineering the locals in order to make better slaves than snack food. Oh dear, that doesn't sound too good for the humans, does it? But no, he wanted the humans to be more than. Is there a clue to evolution here? Like the time when Enki is excusing himself for having revealed to Noah that the big flood was coming because the asteroid's coming close by. And you know what his excuse was? Noah was able to lucid dream. And the time when Gilgamesh says, well, I can't get the gold powder to become immortal. But then when he proved he could lucid dream. So you see, they even recognized that when the aura got to the point of lucid dreaming, then these humans were more than slaves and snack food. Ooh, now here comes a clue. What did they mean by an aura that was plasma projective enough to lucid dream? Hint, hint, fourth dimension, ascension, you know, this direction of spiritual evolution. So they even had a name for Tantra, as Anton Parks puts out pretty well. At one point, Enki's mother comes to him and says, no, that girl is not right for you because you will not achieve immortality with Tantra with her. Sorry. In other words, if you couldn't get your auras to fuse to immortalize, then you need to pick a different partner. Thank you very much. Enki was like, Jewish mother? No. So point being that there was a genetic agenda to Enki. Unfortunately, and I have to say this gently, that those who have been in communication with Enki more recently, as I cannot reveal all my sources here, are still clear that Enki is still a trickster. And one of the tricks he is known for is cooking up the best DNA he can cook up, as he did here, and then taking some of the genetically engineered super soldiers, Enoch, back. Enoch was one of the best genetic specimens made by Enki. And so the dragon queens back in Thuban say, Tak, means Draco, Tak means Orion, say, we're calling Enoch back to Orion for inspection. It wasn't about the humans were designed to become gods. No, it was the humans were designed to become better super soldiers for the Draco Confederacy. And a point I'm making here is that Enki actually was known that his genetic engineering was still part of this conflict. The bigger picture of where the Anunnaki fit in that conflict, I think, is described well by Elena Danaan book in her book Gift to the Stars. So where does that leave Thoth? If Thoth is Hermes, Thoth's symbol is the caduceus, which means phase conjugation. And if the Thoth bloodline becomes the Grail and the Christian and everything that we think of as good, what was Thoth's agenda? You know, Thoth is running around the planet changing his name from Hermes to Thule to Veracocha to Quetzalcoatl. And what's he doing? He is engendering the indigenous peoples. And what did the indigenous peoples have? They had lucid dreaming. hundreds of generations born on the same genetic lines, their DNA was becoming implosive with respect to the Earth, phase conjugate coherent, called a Abraxas point, enabling their DNA to become ensouled. And that is Humpty Dumpty's egg. And that is Hermes' agenda. So here's the fun question when we ask, look, Hermes built a pyramid, Giza, Cairo, right? Now, we learn from the Federation that, in fact, pyramids around the world were using the phase conjugate low frequency infrasound harmonic cascade of the Schumann harmonics piezoelectrically to implode a capacitive diode to implode, compress, accelerate longitudinal interferometry around the planet called a world wireless power grid. That's what the pyramids were doing. That's why they're all at the dodecahedral nodes, because they embed in the longitudinal array, which is the only way to get wireless power distributed efficiently, which Tesla really didn't quite figure out. And he didn't have the frequency signature right either. But we now know the physics much, much better. Point being is, pyramid technology was very widely in use, and also that same implosive capacitance could be used for plasma projecting a soul back into the stars. Like an immortality machine? Well, that's what they say the pyramid was. Well, so here is Thoth Hermes building this pyramid at Giza, and if you time back the orientation to the time it was built, 10,000 BC, years ago roughly, the point directions of the main shafts are Thuban and Orion. Now, if you understand Elena Denon, who I think did a very good job listing all of the major ET interventionists around, Thuban is home for Siakar Draco, and Orion, in big place, lots of different species there, but mostly the bad guys. She calls them the Nebu, the Greys. And so when Hermes built that pyramid, he did it with the money from the Draco, and that pyramid was pointed at the bad guys. In other words, if you were plasma projecting your soul home, and your home is either Thuban or the belt stars of Orion, this is not the good guys. And this is a very interesting insight into plasma parasitism on a global scale, which is 90% of what Earth's religions are, sadly, which is plasma parasitism on a global scale. It's true that Enki and Hermes tried to create a thread of ensouled humans, we call it the Grail, but largely Earth religions, sadly, have been, and even when Yavsky, Swaru, and Gosha go to many episodes saying Christianity was just a Roman invention to enslave people. Well, most of that is correct. I mean, it's sad, but true. So we've gone through Out of Egypt. Now we want to talk about the Muslim story just briefly. That remember that Muhammad again is talking to the same Gabriel who has a similar genetic agenda. But what many people don't realize, who haven't perhaps studied Harold Kautz-Vella and also Johann Fritz, who talk in depth about the most dangerous parasitic AI in the galaxy called black goo, which is a high phase conjugate dielectric carbon nano, self-propagating, self-organizing, dangerous. And many people believe, although I don't think it's proven, is part of the vaccine agenda, sadly, but we have seen it magnetize and self-organize as well. But certainly independent sources confirm the meteorite, the glass meteorite with a vaporized gold in it, which became the Kaaba stone, which later was the ground for the projected powder philosopher's stone from John Dee, that was infected with this black goo. The multiple sources are quite clear, and that when the Muslim rotate and then touch it, the infection with the black goo results in the destruction of green ecosystems, basically anger, and fits what Wilhelm Reich and James DeMeo so well documented, that if you plot the spread of patriarchy, you directly plot the spread of desert. So the spread of desert correlates to the spread of patriarchy, but it goes deeper than that. The spread of desert correlates to the propagation of a Draco AI agenda, which also is called doom, which is, you need to understand, in the Draco, moisture is a poison. It's true, actually, and also oxygen is. So on planets where Draco are winning, the planet is becoming a desert, the radioactivity is going up, and oxygen is going down. If the Orion Wars were called the Oxygen Wars. We need that context to understand where humans fit in this picture. Point being that the Muslim religion, sadly, appears to be related to this infection problem of an AI. And note, among the Draco, although the black goo penetrance is wide, that the higher royal Draco do not allow themselves to be infected by the AI black goo. Remember the physics there. A super high dielectric becomes a communication device, which can be even interstellar, as in the obsidian mirror of the Olmecs or John Dee's scrying stone. And there's an astral hygiene issue because the good guys and the bad guys use the same radio. The phase conjugate dielectric that makes a phase conjugate mirror work in laser optics is the same as the physics of scrying for ancestor phone calls. And that media of propagation, when it's externalized, we talked about the astral hygiene problem of externalized black goo, which would imply that there were astral hygiene problems for those who didn't understand that when you do the scrying and make ancestor phone calls, if you don't have a circle of clear enough intent, unfortunately, you can't sort which ancestors come through on the telephone. So just briefly, I want to finish this part of the story because I want to go on to the science, but to talk about the Jewish religion then, Anne Rice, I think, was correct, and she called it Enkil, the father of all parasites, the father of all vampires. The blood thickens until it's quasi-crystalline. And then remember, Anton Parks got it correct, that Enlil Yahweh was a failed clone who was obviously soulless in our sense of the term, and therefore unable to harness his own juices of bliss, so had to harvest souls in order to, and sadly from that perspective, the Jewish religion is basically a conveyor belt of souls into a hungry ghost, actually. And if you see who the Grim Reaper is and see where the ghosts are going at death, this does not mean that the term Yahweh is inherently bad. Yod He Vav He, if you read goldenmean.info/Yahweh, is actually simply a name for two opposing light cones. But on this planet, in the conflict between Enki and Lil, Enki Osiris, and Lil was Yahweh, Yahweh was also named Satan, the great territorial administrator, the origin of our term Satan, quite literally. And also there was public relation wars. Lucifer was the other name for Enki. So who's the devil? Well, it depends whose public relations budget is higher that month. But the bigger picture here is that the ensouled one is the one that can steer a plasma tornado. And all of Earth religion's names for gods, whether they're angelic beings, remember all of the plasma universe physicists believe in angels now, your name for God is the name for the intelligence of a large plasma cloud. And to start understanding what that means, we figure out why ball lightning responds so well to telepathy, and then how angelic bodies are assembled by the hypercube symmetry. If you see the Ophanim Enochian goldenmean.info/Ophanim, which John Dee did get through that black stone. And that hypercube symmetry of the Ophanim Enochian alphabet, which is how angel plasma bodies assemble their bodies by imploding plasma donuts in hypercube symmetry, became that same alphabet, became the movie Stargate. And well, let's see. So we got the copper foil, the gold plates, the Jewish, the Mormon. We had funny. We talked about Anne Rice, Joseph Smith. All right. So is there a happily ever after to this story? Well, most of Earth religions then really have a sad context. And that is, as I think Lawrence Gardner said correctly, that the Draco, used the royal families of Europe for 1,000 years, like we would show dogs, to try to make Humpty Dumpty have an egg. I mean, a soul. I mean, and they were trying to breed something they had lost, which was long-term memory. And remember, in our last film, we discussed how long-term memory is implosion. It is the definition of wisdom, and you get the long wave in your DNA when it implodes during bliss. That's basically what we said, which leads us to the final thought of this conversation, which was, what have we learned from this conversation about the meaning of ascension? What is the real meaning of spiritual evolution? And for that, I'm going to mention something which I think is rather cool. In today's release from Alex Collier's interview with Elena Danaan and Megan Rose on Donnie Henderson's YouTube channel, in today's conversation, Alex Collier went a little bit further in detail about what he had said years ago, which was, you know, the advanced Andromedans time traveled back into the near past, and they discovered that from this Earth in this solar system at this time in history radiates a wave of chaos and anarchy and control, which is a disease that radiates through the galaxy. And so all eyes then came back to this time epoch in the solar system to try to fix this wave of radiating chaos. Now, that's an old story from Alex Collier and the Andromedans, but today he said a little more. He said, well, you know, these sixth dimensional beings, they act as mentors for the fourth and fifth dimensional. You know, every one of them, the Pleiadians and the Andromeda Federation, they're all saying, well, we're fifth dimensional. And if you're sitting here on Earth as an electrical engineer wondering what the heck do they mean by that? Because you see, he said the sixth dimensional beings came back here and they figured out that the bad Draco had just jumped in all their time travel portals and were getting away. And the sixth dimensional beings were so advanced that they could anticipate where their DNA would show up in all the different timelines and gave the coordinates to the local federation, and they were there waiting. And now the Draco are still losing even worse. And, you know, this sounds far out, but there's one part of this story that I think if you're an electrical engineer like me, you might be able to understand, which is they're always talking about, well, we're 5D and you're 3D, and that makes you inferior. That's a quote from the Pleiadian Tagatan, Swaru, and Gosha, which I think is hilarious. I love picking on those ladies. but there is a piece of truth there. That is, you really need to know what they meant by, you know, we're 3D, they're 5D, and they're 6D, and therefore they're very advanced. And where the hell does that fit into Earth physics? Well, we have some clues now. And that is, remember I was saying, they respect the lucid dreamers. In fact, they need the lucid dreamers. In fact, when Eisenhower's MJ-12 signed the treaty with the wrong ETs and the Greys did all those abductions for the Dracos for pay, 90% were some indigenous blood, meaning lucid dreamers. They needed that DNA for something. Now, is that a clue? So what exactly is a lucid dreamer, and how is that key to the physics of ascension? Well, remember, I have built a plasma field, which is famous for triggering lucid dreams, therify.net. Not only do we have elaborate reports in the blog of triggering lucid dreams, but it's actually being used now by lucid dreaming schools. It's so cool. And that physics of plasma projection, which is how you do remote viewing, literally, which is why the phase conjugate infrasound, flameinmind.com, is the ultimate bliss trigger, binaural beat, because you're imploding the compression and the transverse implodes out, squirting through the Planck threshold, precisely tuned in a phase conjugate cascade, compressing out a longitudinal interferometry, incorrectly called scalar or torsional. And that longitudinal array is the array called the collective unconscious, the Akashic records, the communion of saints, heaven, plains of Sharon. It's all the same stuff. It's inhabiting the array. And I think it might be useful to look at my film recently by that title. Point being, how do you know when you're in the array? And is that what it means to be in the next dimension? And remember, those sixth-dimensional beings who could track the presence in the array to see where the time travelers were going, that's inhabiting the array. So let's talk about an example of inhabiting an array. Have you ever sat in a stone circle or some sacred space and it was absolutely quiet and absolutely still, and suddenly you're in this absolutely crystalline-like stillness, and suddenly a twig snaps in the next room or 100 feet away, and when that little noise happened, at first you thought that noise was inside your body, not outside your body. And then you have to think, oh no, that happened outside my body, but it felt like it was in my body. That is the beginning of inhabiting that array. That array is a fractal. It's a dodecaconstellation. We have all the famous pictures of what that array looks like. And the still points in that array are where the transverse EMF can converge down that perfect 60-degree implosion cone, and the compression results in the longitudinal wave squeezing out the toothpaste tube at the Planck threshold, and that can then inhabit the array. Now, we talked about the physics of ascension when you had that golden ratio cascade in your brainwaves, for example, and that compression algorithm squeezes the plasma vortex tornado inside your head, and the children who can see their eyes, close their eyes and they say, I see a tornado form in my head, and I look through that tube and an eyeball forms. That's why people can take their vision outside their head during death experience and during plasma projection, during remote viewing, etc. It's a plasma vortex. That is absolutely the physics of consciousness. And the plasma vortex forms in a net of fireflies called your synapses, but it doesn't have to stay there. But the plasma vortex requires a capacitively permissive charge environment called sacred space. So if you're in an aluminum building full of electrosmog and bad air, do not try this. It's a bad place to die, and it's a bad place for bliss. So you need a permissive environment called high dielectric, the definition of sacred architecture. So have we learned more about what we meant by the physics of ascension? What is really the definition of the evolution of consciousness? The evolution of consciousness is the size of the array that you inhabit. And all of that possibility requires breath coherence, heart coherence, brain coherence, sacred space, and stillness. The stillness is essential because the still point is where you get leverage on the array. It's where the tornado forms. So that access to the still point where that compression builds. So when they say the next dimension is higher frequencies and higher densities, what they mean is the number of golden ratio exponent multiples times Planck climbs up that ladder, which you can see all the articles at fractalfield.com/vacuum energy, where we have the equations of physics for how harmonic inclusiveness has to grow always golden ratio exponents of Planck, the only definition of a 3D fractal and the only origin of negentropy, and essentially consciousness. So as your aura gets bigger to inhabit that larger and larger array, you get access to larger and larger tornadoes and still points. And that's really the Humpty Dumpty's egg, the holy grail of the genetic recipe sought by when the Greys were paid by the Dracos, because they couldn't follow the yellow brick road to Oz. And you know what you do when you get down at the end of the yellow brick road to Oz? You get to this crystal green stillness within which it is possible to lucid dream. Inhabit the array, propagate into the longitudinal array, and then you throw your weight around inside a bigger tornado, do you see? So yes, it is about a bigger aura, Yes, it is about more harmonic inclusiveness. Yes, that is the only real definition of Holy Grail and evolution of consciousness. It is about becoming centripetal in a larger and larger tornado. So you see, when you step back from the history of religion on this planet, remember, there are, all sources agree, there are tens of thousands of humanoids in this galactic sector alone. So we have been rather childish and foolish imagining that we were so damn special. No. If we can't teach our kids to lucid dream, we don't get to grow up. If you can't teach your child to have a bliss experience, absolutely, you do not have the definition of culture, because they don't become charged radiant. So, once we can define the growth of the aura as why you send your child to school and how you decide whether or not to be vaccinated, and what a doctor's job is to build a soul. It's literally now measurable because the plasma size of the aura is measurable. Remember how many times we said the body politic? Body polis is the name for the plasma coherence projective field, for example, that enables a beehive to swarm, only navigable by royal blood, which means implosive. So to have a body politic means to have the collective plasma projection, lucid dreaming for a group enabled by collective bliss. The only definition biologically of politics, and therefore the only definition actually of what governments are for. So has your government made its decisions based on enabling bliss lately? Well, but once we define bliss as the charged radiance of the aura that defines immune health, called harmonic inclusiveness in medical HRV, we can actually define what a government is for, because we can choose to make children whose aura is plasma projective, therefore what you call ensouled, moving to what we call ascension, and what the ETs have told us, well, we're 5D and you're 3D, and that makes you inferior. Well, in order to grow up, we need to be able to see this big picture. And in closing, I would say one more thing. Remember when Thoth said, you need no longer be spawn of the Nephilim. and in the four corners in the Southwest US, you see all these statues of reptilians sucking on the aura of humans. Remember, humans in their mind deserve to be slaves and snack food until, and Draco's always saw us only in that light, sadly, but the Federation has made a big effort to give us a chance now, but that chance requires us growing up and taking responsibility for the direction of our own destiny. But that responsibility for the direction of our own destiny requires one thing, in my view, well, one thing most emphatically, and that is, you know how we said that if you have a source of bliss, it is the beginning of when you have your own source of charge. Until that point, you get your charge from other people and other things and others and others and others and others. So after you find your source of bliss is the first time you have your own source of charge. It's called implosion. And that is the first time you are not a parasite. And we learn that lesson the hard way by having these Draco and the Nebu who do not have a source of bliss. No, they do not have a source of bliss. It's actually true. They're incredibly powerful and their brainwaves can feel like a vice, but in fact, they have a soul evolution problem also. They all have the same problem. How does Humpty Dumpty get an egg? I mean, how do you get a soul? And to get a soul, you need that DNA implosion that's called bliss, the heart cascade, the brainwave cascade. And that beginning of that empowerment is when you have that Kundalini implosion through your aura, and you begin to steer larger and larger tornadoes called going to the next dimension, as it were. So the lessons of history are actually somewhat similar. Let me see if I finished my notes. Inhabit the array, density, high frequency. Yes, and that flameinmind.com, if I may shamelessly suggest, that our tool, flameinmind.com, is probably one of the best ways to measure that. You'll see when you get that golden ratio cascade in EEG, it correlates directly with when the children are able to see without the eyes, when you have bliss experience, when you begin to lucid dream. And note that exact low-frequency cascade of Schumann harmonics and the brainwave alpha beta of bliss is precisely how we feed Therify.net infrasound to produce lucid dreaming. And by the way, when Danny Schreiber returned from his death experience and said, yes, I saw the Heinrich Kluwe form constants geometry that is the map to death. And by the way, he heard the infrasound, the low frequencies of the black hole sonic implosion that enables successful death, the same infrasound you can measure at the Bosnian pyramids, which commercially produce rejuvenation, just the way we produce rejuvenation with that same infrasound at Therify.net in 25 countries. So the principles of implosion, we have a clear physics here to what bliss is and ensoulment and going to the next dimension. The psychology of that, and this is the closing thought here, the psychology of that is exactly as when you are preparing for bliss or death, that only the shareable wave survives. Only the shareable wave enables compression. The shareable wave is a name for the kind of symmetry that when it implodes and enters into the array called heaven or plains of Sharon or Champs-Élysées, that array is inhabitable by only a library of collective survival information called pure principle, theshareablewave.com, which means anger doesn't compress well. It means every single emotion that you've experienced needed to be digested and compressed and rendered into perfectly shareable, meaning you wouldn't dream of needing a secret at that moment. So I think that's most of the notes I had prepared here. You can find the conversations here at fractalfield.com/fusionintheblood and flameinmind.com and therify.net. I can be reached at info@fractalfield.com. And you know what a fractal field is now. You know, the dodecaecosa stellation, also called sacred space, enables the longitudinal array, which is that perfected charge distribution, the Hey Ave, as it were, the plains of Sharon. You know, the plains of Sharon was the infinite electron shells of monatomic gold, according to Lawrence Gardner, but later we learned that that's what a perfect dielectric produces, which is an infinitely unpackable aura. So you enter into an array in which charge distribution is perfected, kind of the opposite of a modern city. And the real definition of what Uru Asa LM originally meant was a perfectly fractal array. So thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Dan.
Voice is run out.
Can you give your website again so I can type it in for everyone?
Yes, fractalfield.com, fractalfield.com, and therify.net.
Hey, when's your next lecture, Dan? When are you on again?
I have a bunch of events coming up here. Well, you can see them at, I don't happen to have the list in front of me, but you can see them at our Facebook channel is facebook.com/fractalfield, and our YouTube channel is youtube.com/danwinterfractalfield.
Thanks. It's Dan, you need to be at the universities and talk to the scientists. And I mean, this is so important. And, you know, every time I integrate a little bit more. So I like to study you. Thanks for your connections and our friends and all the networks we're part of too.
Yes, well, we are happy to refer our friend to you. We're glad you're there, sir. Thank you. Blessings. Blessings, everybody.
Dan Winter, ladies and gentlemen.